disgusting dog named Dojun started his college journey, and he imagined he was finally living the dream. Reality, however, quickly set in as he found himself hunched over his filthy keyboard, sweating profusely and wrestling with the mounting frustration of another crushing defeat in his favorite game. He was just a typical dumb broke college student, or at least he liked to tell himself that, but his life was far from ordinary. His living situation was complicated by the fact that he was sharing his space with a childhood friend named Ra-on. The internet would have had a field day criticizing him if they knew a guy was living with a female friend, especially considering how their relationship had started. It was a forced connection born from the meddling of their parents, who had become fast friends and decided their children should be inseparable as well. In their younger years, the dynamic was clear. Ra-on excelled at sports and spent her time running with the boys, while Dojun preferred the quiet solitude of his gaming world. They barely acknowledged each other beyond using their first names at school. Everything changed when their mothers started meeting up for coffee and chatting about their lives. Suddenly, Dojun found himself stuck with Ra-on wherever he went. She treated him like a personal punching bag, even going so far as to dunk his head under the water while pretending to teach him how to swim. For 3 long years, Dojun lived in constant dread, secretly wondering if they would end up attending the same university. The nightmare became his reality when they both got into the same school. As they sat on the couch in their graduation gowns, surrounded by the festive mess of confetti, their parents looked on with delight, convinced that this arrangement was a match made in heaven. They had even gone so far as to coordinate their living situation before Dojun could even protest. He had no say in the matter, and just like that, his involuntary cohabitation began. Back in their shared apartment, the dynamic remained as chaotic as ever. Ra-on would storm into his room, kicking the door open to harass him about his gaming performance. She had no patience for his losing streaks and didn't hesitate to get physical, grabbing his shirt or pinching him just to get a reaction. Dojun often found himself wishing she acted a bit more traditionally feminine, but instead, she acted like one of the guys, complete with unkempt hair and a carefree attitude that drove him up the wall. She was as persistent and unpredictable as a wild animal, often looming over him while he tried to focus on his screen. Even when their online friends on Discord tried to intervene and tell Ra-on to leave him alone, she would just dismiss them, obsessing over how many rounds they had lost because of his supposed lack of skill. Dojun was left to mumble to himself, trapped in a cycle of gaming frustration and household bickering, while Ra-on continued to treat his room like her own personal playground. Dojun frantically tried to defend his poor performance, blaming his laggy computer for his mistakes, but Ra-on was having none of it. She retorted that if he had such a problem with the equipment, he should either buy a new one or stop complaining and make do with what he had. Her eyes caught a glimpse of the many open tabs on his screen, and she didn't hesitate to point out that he would probably have less trouble if he learned how to organize his digital life. Dojun's heart skipped a beat when he realized what she was looking at. He scrambled to his feet, trying to block her view, but it was too late. Ra-on had already seen that he was browsing some questionable, sussy content while they were supposed to be gaming together. He tried to stammer out an explanation, claiming he was just innocently surfing the web, but his face turned beet red as the realization hit him. Their friends on Discord were just as baffled, questioning what was happening in the background, only for Ra-on to bluntly announce that Dojun had been watching strange, suggestive material while they were all supposed to be having a good time. She even mockingly described it as some kind of weird hypnosis content. One of their other friends, Ju-eun, chimed in to mention that she had actually seen such things popping up on social media lately. Dojun was mortified, wondering how such a niche and unpopular thing could even be considered a trend, while inwardly cursing his bad luck. He desperately hoped that Ju-eun was just joking to cover for him, though he knew deep down that Ra-on wouldn't let this slide. Looking back, Dojun couldn't help but reflect on his past. He had spent his youth falling for all sorts of bizarre conspiracy theories and odd trends, once even believing the strange rumors Ra-on used to spread just to mess with him. She had a way of making the most ridiculous lies sound like absolute truth, leaving him feeling constantly flustered and foolish. He decided that this was his perfect chance to get some revenge. He figured that if he could convince her to play along with a fake hypnosis prank, he would finally have a hilarious story to share with his friends over drinks. He approached her with the idea, acting as if he wanted to share something special, and, to his surprise, Ra-on didn't immediately turn him down. She sat there, listening as he set up a simple coin on a string, acting out the role of a hypnotist while telling her to relax and breathe. Ra-on watched him with a look of cool detachment, clearly unimpressed by the effort. Once he finished his little performance, she immediately brushed it off, confirming that she hadn't been affected in the slightest. She stood up, ready to move on, but her expression shifted into something more thoughtful and quiet. Dojun sat cross-legged on the floor, holding the coin on a string with an intense focus that made him look like he was in a deep trance. Ra-on watched him with a mix of amusement and irritation, wondering why he was spacing out so completely. She teased him about being disappointed that his little experiment had failed to catch her, eventually telling him to just drop the act and get up. She couldn't help but laugh, wondering if the real joke was that he had somehow managed to trap himself in his own game. She decided to take matters into her own hands by giving him a sharp flick to the forehead. When that didn't wake him, she started tapping his head repeatedly, warning him that he would keep getting hit until he stopped his nonsense. She crouched down, leaning in, and asked if he really thought he could keep up this charade forever. She taunted him, threatening to keep hitting him until he finally dropped the act and returned to reality. Dojun was inwardly panicking, wondering if she was actually a bit of a psychopath because of how naturally she doled out these little punishments. He felt like his head was becoming a target for her hand-shaped sword, leaving him to nurse his stinging skin in silence. Ra-on continued to press him, wondering if he was really going to take his commitment to this prank so far. She watched him closely, wondering if he had truly been caught in his own trap since he still had not reacted. She felt a strange flush of heat rising to her face as she looked at him, leaving her to wonder what exactly she was thinking about at that moment. She was clearly frustrated, running her hands through her hair and trying to clear her head, but the more she dwelled on his behavior, the more her annoyance grew. She decided to try one more time to snap him out of it, leaning in and asking what he was thinking about all by himself. Dojun finally broke his silence, only for the situation to take a sudden and unexpected turn. As they sat there, the air between them grew thick, with an awkward, heavy tension. Ra-on found herself suddenly breathless, kneeling on the floor as if she had just finished a long race. Dojun stared at her, his heart hammering against his ribs like a drum, and realized with a jolt that things had escalated far beyond a simple prank. Ra-on stood over Dojun, feeling her patience thinning as she commanded him to wake up. She was fully committed to her plan, even though her heart was pounding in her chest. Dojun, meanwhile, lay there in a state of sheer panic, wondering what on earth she was trying to accomplish with this bizarre display. He found himself hyper-aware of everything around him, including the fact that her posture left him feeling more than a little flustered. He knew he should not be having these kinds of sussy thoughts, but the situation was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Just as he was internally pleading for her to stop, Ra-on lunged forward, pressing him down and pulling at his shirt under the guise of making him more comfortable. Dojun was completely caught off guard, his eyes widening in shock as he realized she was not going to let the act slide. He felt his limits being tested with every passing second, and he decided he would try to act as if he were slowly waking up to diffuse the tension. Ra-on suddenly stopped, clearly struggling with her own resolve. She wiped her forehead, panting heavily and clearly frustrated by the way things were spiraling. She admitted to herself that she was acting foolish for even considering such a move. In an attempt to salvage the situation, she decided to leave him in his current state, perhaps hoping to embarrass him just enough to get a rise out of him. Dojun lay on the floor, feeling the sting of his earlier decisions. He cursed himself for ever pretending to be hypnotized, as it had only led to this incredibly awkward predicament. He felt like he was being humiliated at every turn, and he reached a point where he simply wanted to drop the facade entirely. He promised himself that he would stand up, walk away, and pretend this never happened. But before he could make his move, Ra-on leaned back in, her finger poking at his cardio gear in a way that made him jump out of his skin. He let out a loud, frantic shout, demanding to know what she was doing. Ra-on, looking just as flustered and embarrassed as he was, pointed at him and asked if he even realized what he was letting happen. The situation was reaching a point of no return as Ra-on continued to tower over Dojun, testing the limits of his supposed trance with increasingly sussy movements. Dojun was currently doing his absolute best to remain a motionless statue on the hardwood floor, though his internal monologue was screaming in a mix of panic and utter confusion. Just as the tension reached a breaking point, the silence was shattered by a loud sneeze followed by the persistent pinging of Discord notifications. One of their female friends was calling out for Ra-on over the voice channel, wondering where she had disappeared to and why everything was so quiet. Startled by the sudden intrusion of the outside world, Ra-on lunged for the computer desk in a blind panic. In her desperate scramble to mute the microphone and hide the sussy sounds of their struggle, she grabbed the expensive recording equipment with way too much force. A sickening snap echoed through the room as the wires were yanked clean out of the device, leaving Ra-on staring in horror at the mangled piece of technology in her hand. She was gripped by the terrifying realization that she might have just ruined her reputation and her gear in one fell swoop. While Ra-on spiraled into a silent crisis at the desk, Dojun remained flat on his back, secretly cursing the day he decided a hypnosis prank was a good idea. He watched through squinted eyes as Ra-on hunched over the keyboard, frantically trying to salvage the situation while her friends continued to log off one by one. The silence that followed was heavy with mutual embarrassment, as both of them were now acutely aware of how ridiculous they looked. Ra-on eventually sat back in the gaming chair, her gaze falling upon the open browser tab that Dojun had been looking at earlier. The screen displayed a colorful comic illustrating exactly how to break a hypnotic spell with a simple snap of the fingers. Seeing a potential solution to her problem, Ra-on decided to put the theory to the test. She leaned over Dojun and delivered a sharp, confident snap right near his ear. Sensing that this was his best opportunity to end the charade without admitting he was faking, Dojun executed a theatrical wake-up performance. He bolted upright with a dazed expression, clutching his head and groaning about a sudden, intense migraine. He began to comment on how much his body ached, wondering aloud why he felt like he had been through a physical gauntlet. Ra-on, thinking quickly to cover her own tracks, immediately spun a web of lies to explain the chaos. She told him that he had simply claimed to be exhausted before passing out cold on the floor and making a massive scene in his sleep. Dojun looked around the room in a state of genuine bewilderment, only then realizing that he was sitting in the middle of the floor wearing nothing but his blue clothes. The situation only grew more complicated as Dojun made a very valid point about Ra-on's wearing too much clothes. He observed that she was also just sitting there in her athletic wear, which caused her to completely freeze up. Ra-on was hit with a sudden wave of intense embarrassment and immediately started scrambling to gather her things while trying to act as if everything was normal. She was desperate to know if anything out of the ordinary had occurred, while Dojun was supposedly unconscious, but she could not quite bring herself to look him in the eye. Dojun hid behind his own shirt to mask his growing blush, while Ra-on nervously laughed it off and claimed he had simply been talking in his sleep. She decided that she had reached her limit for the day and made a hasty exit while slamming the door behind her with enough force to rattle the walls. Left alone in the quiet room, Dojun felt like an absolute failure and sat on the floor wondering how a simple joke could have backfired so spectacularly. He stared at his mangled recording gear and realized that he was totally doomed now that his primary source of entertainment was in pieces. He felt like Ra-on's chaotic energy had completely drained his soul, and he finally collapsed onto his bed in a heap of exhaustion. He spent a few moments debating whether it was worth even getting up for food, before deciding that his pride was already gone and his stomach was starting to complain. Fast forward 1 week and the dynamic in the apartment had reached a bizarre new level of awkwardness. Dojun was now reduced to sneaking through his own home and acting like a secret agent just to avoid a run-in with his roommate. He found himself carefully balancing a tray of hot dumplings outside her door and wondering why he had allowed himself to become a delivery driver for someone who clearly wanted nothing to do with him. He was starting to seriously regret his life choices and wished more than ever that he was living in a solo apartment far away from his parents' meddling. He finally reached a breaking point and decided that the only way forward was to come clean and be honest about the prank. He pulled out his phone to send a long overdue apology and explained that the entire hypnosis trend was just a silly rumor he had used to mess with her. Inside her own room, Ra-on was having a similarly rough time and sat on her bed, looking completely worn out by the lingering tension. She felt a heat in her face that would not go away and was startled when her phone vibrated with a message from Dojun. He told her that she needed to come out to the living room so they could finally settle things once and for all. Ra-on could only sit there and sigh. Dojun sat at the dining table while feeling the weight of the silence that had filled their apartment for an entire week. He scratched his head nervously as he tried to find the right words to break the ice and settle the lingering tension. He pointed out that their mothers had gone to the trouble of cooking a nice meal for them, and it seemed like a waste not to at least eat together like normal roommates. He struggled with the idea of keeping his mouth shut forever, and even wondered if she would feel better if she just went back to her old ways of picking on him to vent her frustration. Ra-on eventually joined him at the table, but she looked like she wanted to be anywhere else in the world. As Dojun prepared himself to finally admit that the hypnosis was nothing more than a silly prank, his roommate suddenly lunged toward him. Before he could even blink, a fist stopped inches from his nose, which left him completely wide-eyed and frozen in place. To his absolute bewilderment, Ra-on pulled out a coin tied to a string and began dangling it rhythmically in front of his eyes. Dojun realized with a sinking heart that she was attempting to turn the tables and hypnotize him using the very same ridiculous method he had used on her. He briefly contemplated his options and wondered if he was really going to have to commit to this act for a second time just to keep the peace. Deciding that leaning into the drama was his best bet, he let out a theatrical yell of surprise, as if the swaying coin had finally taken hold of his mind and stolen his willpower. Seeing his dramatic response, Ra-on slammed her hand onto the table with a triumphant look and celebrated her supposed success. She began to spiral into a mix of guilt and excitement, while admitting to herself that she had promised not to use these strange methods again. She blamed Dojun for being the one to call her out of her room in the first place, because hiding away was the only way she knew how to handle her conflicting emotions. She claimed that seeing his face made it nearly impossible for her to keep her composure or act rationally. She stood up and loomed over him with an intense expression as she struggled to catch her breath and regain some sense of authority over the situation. She made it clear that whatever happened next was entirely his fault for being the one to reach out first and disrupt her sanctuary. Dojun stared blankly at the swaying coins and realized with a start that Ra-on was actually trying to hypnotize him back. He felt a wave of internal conflict as he wondered if he was really going to have to play the part of a mindless puppet for a second time just to see where this ridiculous situation was heading. Deciding that he might as well lean into the drama, he let out a loud and very convincing shout of shock as if his brain had officially left the building. Ra-on was absolutely thrilled by his reaction and slammed her hand on the table while celebrating her apparent success at mastering the forbidden arts. She admitted to herself that she had promised never to go this far, but seeing his face made it impossible for her to act like a normal human being anymore. She began to pour her heart out while believing that Dojun was in a deep trance and could not judge her for what she was about to say. She confessed that it had been incredibly difficult to live with her secret feelings for all these years and bluntly stated that she actually liked him quite a lot. Dojun was internally reeling from the shock and could hardly believe his ears as he listened to the girl who used to treat him like a punching bag suddenly become so sussy. He reflected on how the easygoing girl he knew had spent years ignoring his presence while secretly harboring a massive crush. Ra-on did not stop at just words and decided to take full advantage of the situation by leaning in. She eventually climbed into his personal space and surprised him with a sudden and very sussy cardio gesture that left his head spinning. As the two sat there in the quiet dining room, Dojun began to wonder what on earth had been going on in her head over the past week while she was hiding in her room. He realized that this was the moment she had been waiting for, and it was far more sussy than anything he had imagined. Ra-on grew even more emotional and began to tear up while complaining about how he was only ever interested in playing his video games. Ra-on was now a sobbing mess of emotions as she sat on the table while calling herself an idiot and a total disgrace for even attempting such a sussy cardio move. Dojun watched in stunned silence while feeling a strange mixture of guilt and absolute bewilderment as she continued her tearful monologue. She wondered why she had to be so miserable all the time, and accused him of being incredibly dense for not noticing her feelings after years of living under the same roof. She felt that he should have at least paid a little more attention to her, instead of just focusing on his digital world and his gaming. In a desperate attempt to regain some control over the chaos, Ra-on reached for the coin on the string one last time. She dangled it in front of him again while whispering that he should just have his way with her as if it were some scripted scene from a movie. This was the absolute limit for Dojun, who realized that the situation had crossed into a territory he no longer recognized from his favorite stories. He finally reached out and swatted the coin away while dropping his dazed expression for a look of serious annoyance. He pointed out that she seemed a little too excited about the idea and wondered why she was so eager for him to actually follow through with her suggestions. The realization hit Ra-on like a ton of bricks as she stared at his very alert and very judgmental face. She was completely horrified to learn that he had been listening to her every word and had never actually been under any kind of spell. She tried to stammer out a protest while telling him to cut the crap, but Dojun was officially done playing along with her games. The dynamic shifted instantly as Dojun took hold of the situation with a level of intensity that caught her completely off guard. He grabbed her hair and covered her mouth to stop her from shouting threats while pinning her down against the table. He told her that he could not help himself anymore because she was the one who had practically begged for this kind of confrontation. He commanded her to just shut up and listen for once while he finally got a chance to speak his mind after a full week of hiding. Later, after the cardio session, the situation in the apartment had reached a state of total system failure as Dojun stood frozen and completely exposed while Ra-on frantically snapped her fingers in his face. She was clearly losing her mind as she repeatedly clicked her fingers and demanded to know if his batteries had simply died because he had suddenly stopped moving altogether. The reality of their current state finally began to sink in, and Ra-on realized she was standing there very sussily while staring directly at him. She let out a high-pitched scream that likely rattled the windows of the entire building and scrambled to hide herself as her face turned a deep shade of crimson. She grabbed her things in a blind panic and fled the room while slamming the door with enough force to leave Do-jun vibrating on the spot. He stood there in the middle of the room in total bewilderment, while shivering from the sheer intensity of the encounter and wondering how his life had spiraled into such a cardio mess. He felt a strange sense of déjà vu as he struggled to process what had just occurred and realized that he was now facing a crisis of epic proportions. The scene shifted to a university lecture hall where Do-jun was currently experiencing a massive existential crisis of his own. As the professor droned on about the philosophical teachings of Leo Tolstoy and the true meaning of life, Do-jun felt like his soul was slowly leaving his body. He sat hunched over his desk while nursing a growing headache and concluded that he was officially ruined beyond repair. He couldn't stop thinking about the fireball of a friend known as Ra-on, and wondered if he had truly made a fatal mistake with his recent actions. He worried about whether the timing of their cardio encounter would lead to even more complicated consequences, and felt a deep sense of dread about facing her again. His internal spiral was interrupted by the persistent buzzing of his phone, as his gaming circle began pinging the group chat. He looked at the messages from his friends who were all planning a night out for drinks, and realized that whoever failed to show up would be stuck paying the entire bill. Do-jun felt that staying away would only make him look even more suspicious, so he reluctantly messaged them that he would be arriving late. He spent the rest of the class period breaking his pencils in frustration and wishing there was any other solution besides telling the truth or facing the group. He eventually arrived at a brightly lit street and found the restaurant where his friends were already gathered. He put on his best fake smile and waved to the group while apologizing for his late arrival as he walked into the establishment. He looked over at the table and saw the familiar faces of the women he frequently played games with online. Among them was Hwang Na-rong, who was a year younger than him and never missed an opportunity to make fun of his gaming skills or his general lack of punctuality. Sitting next to her was Da-rae, who always maintained a cool and chic personality while she focused on grilling the meat. Another friend greeted him with a smile and suggested they place another order now that he had finally joined them. The most pressing issue was Ra-on, who was sitting at the table and radiating an incredibly heavy energy that made the air feel thick with tension. She stared at him with an expression of pure hostility and asked why he couldn't have come any quicker while the rest of the group continued to tease him. Do-jun looked over at the woman he considered his only ray of sunshine in a group otherwise filled with bullies. She had once been his tutor and remained his perfect ideal type because of her neat appearance and calm demeanor. He sat at the table, feeling the weight of the collective silence, while wondering if his friends had already heard everything about the recent incident. The atmosphere was a far cry from their usual dynamic, where Do-jun would typically say something foolish enough to earn a sharp chop to the head from Ra-on. The peace did not last long, as Na-rong pointed out how unusual it was for the two of them to be ignoring each other so completely. She teased him about the promise he made to pay for the meal since he was the last one to arrive, and suggested that he just accept his fate. The group continued to enjoy the celebration, while the leader offered a cheerful toast to keep the mood light. Do-jun took a drink, while privately admiring the cuteness of his former tutor and wishing that her relationship status were different, even though he knew there was nothing he could do about it. The conversation took a dangerous turn when Na-rong leaned in to ask why they were being so quiet. She noted that their vibes seemed completely different today, and playfully wondered if they had finally started going out. Do-jun accidentally made matters worse by mentioning that Ra-on had been refusing to come out of her room for days. This revelation sent the group into a frenzy of curiosity as they demanded to know if the two had actually started living together. Ra-on reached her absolute limit and grabbed a glass bottle with a look of pure menace in her eyes. She dared anyone to ask that question again and declared that a person would have to be out of their mind to ever live with a guy like him. Do-jun sat there nursing his own frustrations and silently agreed that he would also have to be completely insane to share an apartment with her. He realized he had made a grave mistake by showing up at all and feared that if the conversation continued, they would eventually start talking about the hypnosis prank. Deciding that he had seen enough, he abruptly stood up to leave while the others tried to call him back. As he walked away, his former tutor caught up to him on the sidewalk and noted that it was their own fault for being a bit too drunk and curious. She explained that their constant teasing made the group wonder about the true nature of their relationship. Do-jun tried to brush it off, but his heart skipped a beat when she admitted that she wanted him to be honest instead of hiding things. The situation reached a peak of awkwardness when she softly brought up the incident from the other day and specifically mentioned the hypnosis thing. The conversation on the sidewalk had taken a turn for the worse, as Dojun's former tutor brought up the recent hypnosis incident. Dojun felt his heart skip a beat and tried to play it off by mentioning the time she helped him out earlier, but she quickly clarified that she was interested in something much more personal. She used her hands to suggest that perhaps he and Ra'an had developed a much sussy bond than they were letting on, and even wondered if he actually had feelings for his roommate. Dojun was completely blindsided by the sudden line of questioning and struggled to find a response before realizing that Ra'an herself was standing just a few feet away and watching them with an icy expression. He felt like he had been caught red-handed and quickly made a loud excuse about needing to use the restroom just to escape the crushing awkwardness of the moment. Back inside the restaurant, the atmosphere at the dining table had become so heavy that it was practically suffocating. Narong eventually reached her breaking point and decided that she was tired of the group sitting around like a bunch of nervous carnivores while the mood slowly died. She slammed her hand onto the table and declared that it was time for a bottle cap drinking game to force everyone back into the spirit of the night. She explained the rules with a sussy glint in her eyes and noted that the winner could either make someone take a drink or deliver a physical punishment to the person sitting right next to them. Dojun realized with a sinking heart that he was sitting directly to the right of Ra'an, who looked like she had been waiting all night for an opportunity to vent her frustrations. Ra'an took the bottle cap and prepared herself with a level of focus that was frankly terrifying to witness. To everyone's absolute shock, she managed to flick the twisted metal tail clean off the cap in a single attempt, which felt completely rigged to the horrified Dojun. Without wasting a single second, Ra'an delivered a punch so powerful that it sent him reeling, while the others watched in a mix of amusement and concern. Dojun nursed his injury while concluding that this was definitely calculated revenge for the hypnosis prank he had played on her earlier. The situation only grew more dire when the group realized that because she succeeded, Ra'an was entitled to take another turn, and she was already preparing her next move with a very determined expression. Dojun found himself sprawled on the floor in a state of silent misery after the latest display of his roommate's terrifying accuracy. He lay there with a pained expression while cursing his luck and concluding that she was definitely targeting him on purpose. Ra'an looked down at him with a cold and unimpressed expression while commanding him to stop making a scene and get off the ground immediately. The rest of the group watched the awkward display in silence while the meat continued to sizzle on the grill and the heavy atmosphere showed no signs of lifting. The scene shifted to the quiet night streets as the two eventually made their way home together. Dojun was still nursing both his pride and his physical injuries while complaining that he had been through enough for one night. He felt that she had been unnecessarily aggressive during their outing and told her to stop touching him for the rest of the day because he was officially annoyed. To distract himself from the lingering tension, he pulled out his phone and began scrolling through his usual digital interests. Ra'an glanced over and saw a bubbly anime character on his screen that was calling him master, which caused her to look at him with a deep sense of judgment. She wondered aloud if he ever got tired of looking at those kinds of things every single day, and specifically mentioned his strange fascination with hypnosis or whatever anime he happened to be watching at the moment. Dojun didn't miss a beat and admitted that he actually did like it that much while trying to maintain his dignity. Ra'an let out a long sigh of frustration and commented that a person like him didn't seem to have any other meaningful life plans beyond his phone screen. The bickering reached a new peak when she claimed her head was starting to hurt and ordered him to go to the convenience store to buy her some hangover medicine. Dojun was completely unwilling to play along and pointed out that she didn't even look remotely drunk to him. He argued that if she really needed medicine, she should just go and get it herself because it was only logical to restock things when you ran out of them. This small act of defiance earned him a swift and very painful kick that sent him stumbling forward yet again. Ra'an adjusted her cap with a dismissive huff and muttered that life would be a lot simpler for both of them if he would just learn to shut up and listen to her for once in a while. Dojun watched Ra'an walk away and felt his entire body trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and utter confusion. He wondered exactly how much longer he was expected to endure her unpredictable behavior because he was already facing a massive headache thanks to the awkward questions from his former tutor. The weight of his lies about the hypnosis trend felt heavier than ever, and he concluded that he had reached his absolute limit after a week of hiding in his own home. He decided that the only way to find any peace was to finally be honest and let everything out instead of keeping it bottled up inside. They eventually reached the apartment building, and Dojun kicked off his shoes with a sense of grim determination. He held the can of hangover medicine in his hand and told himself that telling the truth was the only right thing to do before the situation became even more irreversible. He approached Ra'an's door and knocked softly while announcing that he had returned with the medicine she wanted. He asked her to meet him in the living room because he needed to explain something that he hadn't been able to say earlier. The door creaked open, and Dojun felt his mind go completely blank as he stared at the person standing in front of him. Ra-on had traded her usual, comfortable athletic wear for a highly detailed and incredibly frilly costume that looked exactly like the character from the anime he had been browsing on his phone. She looked like she was about to explode from the sheer intensity of her own embarrassment and struggled to stutter out a formal welcome. Dojun was absolutely floored and asked her what on earth she thought she was doing while pointing at the elaborate outfit. Ra-on shifted her weight nervously and admitted that she had put this all on just so her cardio master could finally hypnotize her properly. Dojun stood frozen in his tracks while trying to process the sight of his roommate in a highly detailed anime outfit that seemed to defy all logic. Ra-on was clearly at her limit of embarrassment and admitted that she had not actually started the hypnosis part of her plan yet. Dojun found himself swallowing hard while staring at the elaborate ruffles and ribbons, and wondered why a girl who had never shown the slightest interest in dressing would suddenly choose this particular moment to go to such extremes. He pointed out the absurdity of the situation, but Ra-on could only tremble while crouching on the floor, and explaining that she felt like he never truly looked at her. The tension in the room began to boil over as Ra-on grew increasingly defensive and claimed that talking never seemed to resolve anything between them anyway. Dojun felt a surge of frustration and challenged her by asking what she would do if he finally admitted that he actually liked her. This sudden declaration caused the atmosphere to shift instantly, and Ra-on stared at him with wide and uncertain eyes. Before she could find the words to respond, Dojun moved with a sudden intensity that caught her completely off guard. He quickly closed the distance between them with a level of assertiveness that silenced her protests. Ra-on let out a small gasp of surprise as she found herself trapped. In a desperate and slightly ridiculous attempt to escape the crushing weight of her own feelings, she reached for the coins on a string and began dangling them frantically in front of his face. She whispered for him to just forget everything that had happened because she was still too terrified to admit her true emotions out loud. She pleaded with him to just bear with her as she resorted to the same silly hypnosis trick he had used on her earlier in the week. Ra-on continued to struggle with her conflicting desires, while acknowledging that she simply couldn't bring herself to say the words he wanted to hear. Dojun did not look like he was in the mood for more games. Ra-on felt her heart hammering against her ribs and addressed him as cardio master while staying in her role. Then they started a cardio session. Later, Dojun was currently experiencing a level of terror that surpassed any difficult boss fight he had ever encountered in his games. He stared at Ra-on as she lay motionless on the floor and felt his heart drop into his stomach while he frantically called her name. He was convinced that their recent cardio session had actually pushed her over the legal limit of exhaustion, and he began to plead with her not to leave this world just yet. His mind was a whirlwind of worst-case scenarios, and he scrambled around the room in a desperate search for his phone so he could call for emergency services. He was on the verge of a total mental breakdown when Ra-on let out a soft murmur and called his name in her sleep. The sheer wave of relief that washed over him was enough to make his knees weak, and he realized that she had simply fainted for a brief moment. He took a deep breath to steady his racing heart and concluded that it was a miracle the situation was not more serious. He decided that the best course of action was to slip back to his own room before things escalated into another awkward confrontation. However, his escape plan was immediately thwarted when a hand reached out and gripped his foot with surprising strength. Ra-on was still caught in the fog of her dreams, but she whispered for him to stay and not leave her alone. Dojun felt a cold shiver run down his spine as he looked down at her hand and realized that his attempt at a quiet exit had failed miserably. Sometime later, the room had been returned to a state of relative order and the evidence of their chaotic evening was tucked away. Dojun had managed to tidy up the space and even found the strength to fold Ra-on's elaborate anime costume and place it neatly on the desk. He stood there, wiping the sweat from his brow, and reflected on just how difficult it was to prepare someone who was completely unconscious. He couldn't help but remember the time Ra-on had struggled to do the same for him, and he finally understood why she had been so frustrated with the process. He decided to be a responsible roommate and placed a cold ice pack on her forehead to help her recover from the heat of the moment. He tried to convince himself that he didn't have any strange feelings for her and that he was only doing what any decent friend would do in this situation. He sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor and stared into space while nursing a sense of deep internal conflict. He had intended to draw a firm line between them tonight, but it seemed that nothing was going according to his plans. He looked over at the sleeping girl and concluded that this entire mess was her fault for being so unpredictable, though he eventually admitted that he was also to blame for how things turned out. He sat there in the quiet room and felt the weight of the future pressing down on him. He worried about what would happen when the sun came up, and he silently hoped that Ra-on wouldn't try to end his life once she realized the extent of their encounter. He was stuck in a loop of regret and wondered if there was any way to go back to the days when they simply ignored each other at school. The peaceful silence was suddenly shattered when Ra-on's eyes fluttered open and she let out a soft groan. Dojun jumped back in total shock and wondered why she was already conscious when he thought he had at least a few more minutes to prepare his defense. Ra-on sat up slowly while holding the ice pack to her head and looked around the room with a dazed and highly suspicious expression. She looked at Dojun and then at the frozen bag in her hand and wondered what on earth he was trying to accomplish with this strange medical treatment. Ra-on sat there with the cold bag and stared at Dojun with a gaze that could melt steel. She wondered if he had developed a new hobby of finding strange items in the house just to interrupt her rest. Dojun stood by the door and felt like a criminal caught in the act while he waited for the inevitable explosion. The silence was heavy as Ra-on looked down and slowly realized that her state of dress was much less sussy than she remembered. She let out a high-pitched scream that likely woke up the neighbors and frantically pulled the blankets around herself to hide her intense embarrassment. Dojun sighed with the weight of a man who knew he had stayed exactly 3 minutes too long. He realized he was probably going to leave the room covered in bruises if he did not make a fast exit. Inside her mind, Ra-on was replaying the events of the last hour like a horror movie she could not turn off. She remembered her own sussy request for more attention during their earlier cardio session and felt a heat in her face that no ice pack could ever hope to fix. She was absolutely mortified that her subconscious had decided to be so forward with the very person she usually treated like a punching bag. She pointed a trembling finger at the door and commanded him to leave her sight immediately. Dojun did not need to be told twice, and he practically fell through the doorway in his haste to escape her icy glare. Once he was gone, Ra-on leaned her back against the door and tried to catch her breath while his earlier confession about liking her echoed through her head. She wondered what she was even supposed to do with information like that after years of pretend hostility. In the living room, Dojun was struggling to process the chaos and began scratching his head in total frustration. He spotted the can of hangover medicine he had bought earlier and decided to drink it in one desperate gulp just to give his hands something to do. He told himself that he did not care about the consequences anymore and began walking toward his own room while grumbling about his terrible luck. Dojun was currently lying in bed and trying to brainwash himself into believing that the events of the evening had never actually happened. He kept telling himself to forget the entire ordeal and insisted that nothing was ever written in the history of his life regarding their recent encounter. He blamed the ridiculous hypnosis trend for his current misery and regretted ever starting such a foolish prank in the first place. Memories of Ra-on in her frilly costume continued to haunt his thoughts, especially the way she had nervously greeted him as her cardio master. He tossed and turned while agonizing over how he could possibly look her in the eye the next time they crossed paths in the hallway. He then scolds himself for even suggesting there would be a next time and concludes that he has officially lost his mind. The silence of his room was suddenly broken by a persistent knocking that pulled him out of his internal spiral. He sat up in alarm and watched as the door swung open to reveal Ra-on clutching a large pillow like a shield. Before he could process why she had returned to his room so late at night, she lunged toward him and began a relentless pillow assault. Dojun was completely blindsided by the flurry of blows and tried to shield himself from the impact while realizing that his roommate was a terrifying creature who probably should not exist in a civilized society. He was trapped on his own bed while Ra-on vented her frustrations in the most sussy way possible. Meanwhile, in a much quieter part of the city, Dojun's former tutor was struggling to focus on her own work. She found herself making simple mistakes on her math problems and realized that she could not concentrate at all because she was far too worried about the tension she had witnessed earlier. She remembered the awkward scene on the sidewalk where Dojun and Ra-on had been bickering like real partners. She pulled out her phone and looked at an old graduation photo where Ra-on was playfully resting her hand on a very annoyed Dojun's head. She reflected on their long history of constant fighting and realized that they might finally be at a point where they needed to have a very serious conversation about the true nature of their relationship. The story shifts back in time to the very first day that Anju-eun walked into a classroom to begin her teaching career. She remembered the rhythmic clicking sound of her black heels against the hallway floor and the overwhelming nerves that came with being a new face in a school full of curious students. She had stepped up to the front of the room and formally introduced herself as their new instructor for the next 4 weeks, while secretly hoping that her voice did not tremble too much. The students had greeted her with polite applause, but the pressure of maintaining a professional image was already starting to weigh heavily on her shoulders. She had attempted to dive straight into the lesson by writing her name on the chalkboard, but her debut performance took a sudden and very ungraceful turn. Her balance failed her at the worst possible moment, and she felt herself tilting uncontrollably until she disappeared behind the teacher's podium with a loud and echoing crash. The entire room had fallen into a stunned silence as she realized that her very first impression as an educator had ended in a total physical disaster. She struggled to sit up while nursing her pride and her injured ankle, and felt an intense wave of regret for ever choosing such high heels for a job that required so much standing. The memory shifted to the end of that same school day, where the golden light of the sunset was filling the empty classrooms with a warm glow. Dojun was the only student left behind in the building, and he was currently locked in a fierce digital battle on his phone while completely ignoring the world around him. His concentration was suddenly shattered when a message from Ra-on popped up on his screen, calling him a moron and causing him to lose his focus at a critical moment in the game. He let out a shout of pure agony and tossed his device into the air while cursing his childhood friend for always ruining his most important gaming milestones. He gathered his things in a massive huff and grumbled about how his entire life seemed to revolve around putting up with her constant and poorly timed meddling. As he made his way down the quiet corridor, he was surprised to see a familiar figure sitting alone in the shadows of the faculty waiting area. He realized it was the new teacher who had made such a dramatic and loud entrance earlier that morning, and he wondered why she was still at school so late in the evening. Ju-eun looked up with a tired but kind expression and eventually recognized him as the student who had been watching her clumsy fall with a look of genuine confusion. She had swapped her fashionable heels for a pair of comfortable blue slippers and revealed a large bandage on her ankle, which served as a painful reminder of her first day on the job. Dojun noticed her bandaged ankle and asked if it was a result of her earlier ungraceful encounter with the floor. Ju-eun assured him that it was just a minor sprain and nothing to worry about. Dojun began to stammer through a very earnest compliment and explained that he was genuinely impressed by her teaching style. He noted that, unlike the other instructors, she actually took the time to explain everything step by step, which made the material much easier to understand. He went even further by mentioning that, while his friends thought she was tough as nails for getting right back up after her fall, he secretly thought she looked quite cute at that moment. He quickly realized he was rambling and felt a surge of embarrassment as his phone began to buzz with more frantic messages from Ra-on. Before he made his escape, he made sure to tell her that he was looking forward to her future classes and shouted some loud words of encouragement for her to get well soon. Back in the present time, Ju-eun was sitting on her bed and reflecting on how those simple words had been the first true comfort she felt as a new teacher. That memory helped her push through her initial worries and gave her the strength to keep going. She was currently staring at her phone in a state of total panic after sending a very long and detailed message to Dojun regarding the strange hypnosis topic. She wondered what on earth possessed her to be so direct, and eventually buried her face in her pillow while worrying that the entire situation might just be a massive misunderstanding. She tried to return to her work, but found it impossible to concentrate while waiting for a reply that never came. She checked the time and realized that Dojun would normally be online and gaming, but concluded that he must have crashed early after their night of drinking. She decided she would just have to try asking him again the next time they met in person. The scene shifted to a brightly lit convenience store where she was picking up a heavy box of supplies. She admitted to herself that she simply couldn't help herself when it came to looking after others and stepped out into the quiet night air with her purchase in hand. Ju-eun walked through the quiet night streets while feeling a heavy sense of worry that had been building up inside her all week long. She clutched the green gift box tightly and admitted to herself that the situation was bothering her far more than she wanted to acknowledge. Even though it was late and the clock on her phone showed it was already midnight, she found herself standing in the parking lot of Dojun's apartment building. She stared at the dark windows and realized that there was still no response to her long message, which only added to her growing anxiety. She stood there in the moonlight and began to reflect on the nature of their relationship, which had always been defined by clear boundaries. During their time at school, she had remained strictly professional and found it impossible to have a proper conversation with him because she was his teacher until the very end. Even on graduation day, when the campus was filled with cheering students and celebratory photos, she had stayed on the sidelines. She remembered watching from a distance as Ra-on bossily grabbed Dojun to drag him into a group photo while he grumbled in his usual annoyed fashion. Ju-eun had hesitated to approach him back then, and she realized that she was currently facing that same familiar feeling of uncertainty. Determined not to let another opportunity slip away, she eventually made her way to his front door and reached out to press the doorbell. Her hand was trembling as she carefully placed the heavy box of health drinks on the floor and took a deep breath to steady her nerves. She began to rehearse a casual explanation in her head and decided she would claim that she only brought the drinks because her siblings enjoyed them and she happened to have extras. She put on a practiced smile and prepared to act as if her late-night visit was perfectly normal and not at all a result of her overthinking things for 7 days straight. Just as she was about to face him, the silence of the hallway was shattered by a loud and frantic shout coming from inside the apartment. She froze in place as she heard a very familiar female voice calling out for Master Dojun with an intensity that seemed completely out of place for a quiet evening at home. The color drained from Ju-Eun's face as she recognized the voice belonging to Ra-on, and she stood there in total shock while wondering why his childhood friend was in his room making such a sussy scene. Her mind immediately began to spiral into a whirlwind of confusion as she realized the name and the sussy title did not belong together in any normal situation. She felt a sussiness rising to her face while her imagination began to paint a very vivid and suggestive picture of what was happening behind the closed door. She shook her head violently in an attempt to clear the sussy cardio training images from her mind and scolded herself for having such a sussy imagination. She felt incredibly conflicted because as a former teacher and a responsible big person, she knew she had no right to spy on the private lives of her juniors. She decided that the best course of action was to just leave the drinks and head back home before things became even more awkward for her. Just as she prepared to make her quiet exit, another loud and rhythmic sound echoed through the hallway and made her stop in her tracks once again. She felt a surge of intense anxiety and wondered what on earth could be going on inside to cause such a commotion. Her curiosity finally won the battle against her professional ethics, and she decided that she needed to see the truth for herself just this one time. She crept toward the window with trembling legs and struggled to maintain her balance in her heels while she searched for a gap in the blinds. The sight through the glass was even more shocking than she had imagined, and it caused her eyes to widen in total disbelief. She saw Dojun and Ra-on in the middle of a very sweaty and chaotic cardio session, while Ra-on was still dressed in that elaborate anime costume. Ju-en was absolutely mortified as the realization hit her that they had truly gone all the way and shared an incredibly cardio moment together. She felt a wave of dizziness and collapsed into a crouch on the floor, while burying her face in her hands to hide her shame. She sat there in the shadows and reflected on how pathetic she must look for spying on her juniors in the middle of the night. She regretted her decision to visit the apartment and wished she could simply disappear into the floorboards rather than deal with the crushing weight of her own thoughts. Her internal spiral was suddenly interrupted when she felt something warm and wet against her hand. She looked down to see a friendly brown dog wagging its tail and looking up at her with a very happy expression. She let out a small shout of surprise as the dog began to jump on her, while its owner tried to pull it back with a look of genuine concern. The woman in the bucket hat apologized profusely and explained that her dog simply loved meeting new people, but Ju-eun could hardly focus on the conversation. The loud and rhythmic sounds from the apartment were still echoing through the hallway and creating an atmosphere of total embarrassment for everyone involved. Ju-eun tried to act as if everything were perfectly fine, but her pale face and trembling hands told a very different story. She realized she couldn't stay another second in that hallway and abruptly stood up to make a run for it. She bolted toward the elevator without offering a proper explanation and left the confused neighbor and her dog standing there in total silence. The brightly lit streets were buzzing with the usual night energy as Dojun sat inside a quiet cafe while staring at his phone with a look of pure dread. He reviewed the incredibly long message from his former tutor and felt his palms growing damp with sweat as he realized the gravity of the situation. He spent a few moments reflecting on how he had managed to dodge a bullet last time and concluded that he was now facing a mountain of awkwardness that he could not easily climb. He nursed his iced coffee with a sense of desperation and hoped that a cold drink would help settle the frantic beating of his heart. As he looked at the ice cubes, he found himself thinking about the ridiculous hypnosis prank and wondered how a simple joke had led to such a complicated mess. He decided that his only way to survive the encounter was to say just enough to satisfy her curiosity without revealing more than he had to. The doorbell chimed and his heart nearly leaped out of his chest when he saw a familiar figure approaching the booth. To his utter bewilderment, his former tutor was sitting across from him while keeping her face completely hidden behind a large menu. He observed her strange behavior and noted that she had not even bothered to open the book to see what was inside. He pointed out that she seemed a bit out of sorts and wondered if something had happened to ruin her day. Ju-en tried to laugh it off with a blush that could be seen from across the room and claimed that her university classes were just taking a heavy toll on her energy. Dojun saw a perfect opportunity to be helpful and pulled out one of the health drinks he had found at his door earlier that evening. He shared a cheerful smile and mentioned that a mysterious person had left them for him, and he felt she should have one to help her feel better. The irony was lost on him, but it hit Ju-eun like a ton of bricks as she stared at the very gift she had left in secret. A heavy silence settled over the table while both of them looked away in a state of mutual embarrassment. Dojun finally broke the silence by mentioning that he knew she was curious about that particular time and he wanted to finally settle the score. He was thinking specifically about the fake hypnosis prank, but Ju-eun's mind was instantly filled with sussy images of the cardio session she had witnessed through the window. She felt a sussiness rising to her face and began to wave her hands frantically in the air while insisting that she was not curious about anything at all. Dojun was completely baffled by her sudden outburst and noted that she was the one who had requested the meeting in the first place. He sighed with the weight of a man who was surrounded by confusion and insisted that they needed to clear up the huge misunderstanding once and for all. Dojun reached into his pocket and placed the coin on the string onto the table with a theatrical flourish that was clearly masked by a mountain of nervous sweat. Ju-eun could only stare at the little metal prop in total confusion as the silence between them grew even heavier. Dojun struggled to find the right words and eventually decided to claim the entire ordeal was nothing more than a carefully planned hidden camera prank. He put on his best fake smile and told her it was all a convoluted performance intended to cheer her up because she had seemed so down lately. He even joked about how proud he felt that she had completely fallen for the act since they had been pretending ever since their very first fight. Ju-eun felt her blood run cold as she listened to his blatant lies and realized the terrifying truth of the situation. She concluded that if the hypnosis was just a fake prop and a silly joke, then the sweaty cardio session she had witnessed through the window last night was a very real and very intentional choice. She felt a wave of dizziness while wondering if he was simply trying to hide his sussy relationship with Ra-on by using this elaborate story. Dojun continued to laugh awkwardly while scratching the back of his neck and insisting that his performance deserved an award for being so convincing. Ju-eun eventually reached her limit and let the truth slip out by mentioning the cardio encounter she had seen the night before. The atmosphere shifted instantly as Dojun froze in his seat with a look of pure terror while his mind struggled to process how she could possibly know about that. Ju-eun was equally horrified by her own slip of the tongue and began to tremble violently as the realization set in that she had just admitted to spying on them. Dojun is currently stuck in a state of terminal nervous laughter while trying to convince himself that his former tutor must be joking about the situation. He feels a cold sweat breaking out as he frantically wonders how on earth she could possibly know about his cardio evening with Ra-on. He desperately hopes that she simply overheard a phone call or made a very convenient mistake in her observations. He even goes as far as to imagine that she might have mistaken him for her own partner because the alternative is much too terrifying to consider. Ju-eun is currently a vibrating mess of embarrassment and struggles to keep her composure while offering a very formal and shaky apology. She tries to reclaim her authority by speaking to him as his teacher or an older sister figure, but her face is so red it looks like it might actually start glowing. She pleads with him to simply forget every weird and suggestive thing she just said as if her words could be deleted like an unwanted message. The pressure finally reaches a breaking point and Ju-eun begins to cry right there at the table, which leaves Dojun in a state of total system failure. He scrambles to find a box of tissues while trying to figure out why she is suddenly being so hard on herself. Ju-eun is caught in a spiral of self-pity and acknowledges to herself that she already knew about his feelings for Ra-on. She wonders what she was even trying to achieve by bringing up such a sussy topic in the first place. Realizing that a public cafe is the worst place for a crying session, Dojun suggests they step outside to get some fresh air. They end up in a quiet alleyway where the local smokers are watching them with a mix of curiosity and boredom. Dojun watches her closely and wonders if she is starting to feel any better now that they are away from the crowd. He leans against the wall and reminds her that she shouldn't feel pathetic for making a mistake because everyone has those moments from time to time. He goes a step further and tells her that she can keep making as many mistakes as she wants as long as he is around to see them. He reflects on their history and notes that while she is considered a perfect teacher nowadays, they only became close friends because of her very ungraceful fall on her first day. He shares a genuine laugh and admits that he actually wants to get to know that clumsy side of her better. Ju-eun hides her face behind her hair while thanking him in a soft voice that is barely audible over the city noise. Dojun notices the heavy smell of cigarettes in the air and concludes that they should probably move on before they both start reeking of smoke. He observes that she has been working hard with her tutoring and offers to call a taxi to make sure she gets home safely. However, Ju-eun is not quite ready to end the night and surprises him by reaching out to stop his hand. She looks at him with a determined expression and asks if he would like to go for a real drink with her instead. They eventually settle into a dimly lit bar where the atmosphere is thick with the sound of clinking glasses and the smell of savory snacks. Ju-in does not waste any time and begins to down her drink with a level of speed that leaves Do-jun feeling more than a little concerned. He watches her empty the glass and mentions that even though she had a rough day, she is drinking far too much too fast. Ju-un simply stares back at him with a hazy gaze and suggests that he should be the one to drink responsibly so he can take her home later that night. Do-jun agrees to stay for a bit while noting that this is actually the first time anyone has ever invited him to grab a drink. He understands that she is dealing with some personal issues and asks if she is genuinely curious about the recent events that have been bothering her. He continues to pour her drinks while observing her carefully and thinks to himself that her mood seems to have improved quite a lot compared to how she was acting earlier in the evening. Suddenly, his phone begins to vibrate with a persistent call from Ra-on. Do-jun feels a surge of dread and immediately decides not to answer it because he is already tired of their constant bickering at home. He worries that Ra-on would cause a massive scene if she found out he was hanging out with someone else and concludes that it is better to just ignore the distraction for now. The calm atmosphere is shattered when Ju-un casually mentions that she knows they are outing. Do-jun reacts by spitting out his drink in total shock and frantically tries to regain his composure while wondering where that idea even came from. He tells her that there is no way on earth he would ever be with someone like Ra-on and feels his face turning a deep shade of red as he tries to deny the accusation. Inside his mind, he is haunted by a vivid and embarrassing memory of their recent cardio encounter, which makes his denial feel a lot less convincing to himself. Ju-un watches him with a sad and knowing expression and concludes that he is simply a liar because his words contradict everything she witnessed with her own eyes through the window. Feeling like she is on the verge of a total emotional breakdown, she decides to excuse herself and head toward the restroom. She walks down the hallway in a daze while replaying the situation in her head and feeling incredibly pathetic for how things are turning out. Meanwhile, Do-jun eventually gives in to the ringing phone and finds himself arguing with Ra-on about why she is calling him at such an inconvenient time. He is standing right outside the restroom area when the door suddenly swings open and he finds himself face to face with a very startled Ju-un. Ra-on hears a strange muffled noise over the line and immediately demands to know if he is actually out with Ju-un at this very moment. The scene shifts to the quiet restroom area where the tension finally boils over into a state of total chaos. Ra-on is still screaming through the phone while demanding to know why Do-jun is ignoring her so blatantly. Do-jun is currently struggling with the very sussy behavior of Ju-un and feels a surge of panic as he realizes his former tutor is watching him with an expression that is far from professional. Ju-un looks completely offended that he would try to lie about her presence, and she decides that her teacher persona has officially reached its expiration date for the night. Do-jun frantically tries to convince Ra-on that he would never be hanging out with someone else this late, but his words only make the situation worse. Ju-un denies their connection and feels a wave of intense frustration rising in her chest. She realizes that if he is going to be so dishonest about their relationship, then she might as well give him a reason to tell the truth. She decides that she still has a fighting chance to win his attention and concludes that she can definitely be more impressive than his roommate if she really tries. In a sudden and highly unexpected move, Ju-un lunges forward with a level of assertiveness that catches Do-jun completely off guard. The phone slips from his hand and clatters onto the floor while he finds himself in a sussy position. Jo-eun is now fully committed to a very intense cardio session and leaves Do-jun in a state of total shock. He realizes with a jolt that his once calm and neat ideal type has transformed into a very determined competitor who is not interested in following the rules anymore. The atmosphere in the small room becomes incredibly heavy as the two of them get caught up in the sussiness of the moment. Do-jun is struggling to catch his breath and wonders how his life managed to spiral into such a complicated situation in the span of a single evening. Ju-in continues her performance with a level of focus that is frankly terrifying, and she refuses to let him escape her. However, the intense silence of their encounter is suddenly shattered when Ju-in lets out a sharp and very recognizable cough. On the floor, the phone is still connected, and Ra-on immediately recognizes the sound coming through the speaker. She notes with a chilling level of certainty that she has heard that specific cough many times before and demands to know exactly where they are hiding. Ra-on declares that she is heading to their location right this second to handle the situation herself. In the middle of the looming disaster, Ju-in remains completely unfazed and simply leans in to whisper a very soft and suggestive inquiry about whether he actually liked what just happened. Then he hangs up the call. Ra-on is currently experiencing a level of rage that could likely power a small city as she stares at her disconnected phone screen in total disbelief. She wonders if Do-jun actually has a death wish for daring to hang up on her in the middle of such a sussy situation. She sits in her room as a vibrating mess of fury and begins to prepare herself to hunt him down no matter where he might be hiding. Back in the dimly lit restroom area, Dojun is sitting on the floor and holding his head while trying to process the absolute disaster of his current life choices. He struggles to find the words to ask what on earth his former tutor is doing and tries to find a logical explanation for her sudden change in personality. Ju-eun remains kneeling on the floor in front of him and calmly claims that her earlier actions were nothing more than a silly mistake. However, the atmosphere shifts instantly as she reminds him of his own promise that she could keep making mistakes as long as he was around to witness them. Dojun frantically tries to clarify that his words were meant to be a simple gesture of support and not an invitation for a total system collapse, but Ju-eun is no longer listening to his excuses. Then she starts to prepare for more cardio gestures. The sound of the automatic flushing in the background only adds to the crushing awkwardness of the moment as they share a very sussy cardio connection. Dojun is a blushing wreck and tries to bring up the subject of her mysterious partner one last time just to regain some sense of reality. Ju-eun shuts down his concerns by stating very clearly that she does not actually have a partner and wonders why he ever thought such a thing. She decides to prove her point by beginning to prepare clothes while explaining that she is only acting this way because it is him. She admits that she has been doing her absolute best to spend time with him even though he lives such a gaily life with his roommate every day. She gives him a final warning that her behavior for the rest of the night will consist entirely of intentional cardio mistakes before they dive back into another round of their high-intensity cardio session. Dojun was currently experiencing a total system failure as he pleaded with his former tutor to stop before things went any further. He was a blushing wreck and tried to explain that his hesitation was not because he disliked what was happening but simply because the sudden change in her personality was more than his brain could process. Ju-eun looked at him with a mix of hurt and sussiness, while wondering aloud if his reluctance was actually because of his roommate Ron. Dojun felt a surge of panic at the mention of her name, and frantically wondered why she would bring up his chaotic roommate at a time like this, when they were in the middle of such an sussy situation. Ju-eun was not convinced by his protests and accused him of being a total liar who had been playing dumb for far too long. She admitted that she had kept her eyes solely on him for years, and felt a deep sense of frustration that he continued to push her away despite her obvious efforts to get closer. The atmosphere in the small space became even heavier as Ju-eun leaned in, which left Dojun's heart hammering against his ribs. He felt like he was being cornered by a version of his ideal type he did not even recognize, while she questioned if she was simply not enough to capture his full cardio attention. Just as the tension reached a boiling point, the quiet of the hallway was shattered by the sound of someone rattling the door handle. They both froze in a state of pure terror as a loud and persistent banging echoed through the room. A very confused and slightly tipsy man was on the other side of the door, wondering if anyone was actually inside or if he was just talking to himself. The sudden intrusion caused both of them to gasp in shock while they scrambled to stay as quiet as possible to avoid a total social disaster. The drunk man eventually concluded that he must be much more intoxicated than he originally thought because he swore he heard the voices of a man and a woman coming from the stall. To their immense relief, the stranger eventually gave up and stumbled away, while muttering about his own drinking habits and the strange tricks his mind was playing on him. Dojun and Ju-eun were left huddled together in the aftermath of the scare and struggled to regain their composure while dealing with the lingering shock of almost being caught in such a sussy situation. Dojun let out a heavy sigh of relief that the man had left without prying further, even though his heart was still racing from the sheer terror of the moment. Ju-eun acknowledged that the experience was truly scary for both of them. Dojun could only offer a nervous laugh and scratch his head. Ju-eun needed a moment to herself to fix her appearance and requested a little privacy while she cleared her exhaustion. Dojun was more than happy to oblige and promised to give her all the space she needed as he prepared to step out. He realized that they could not stay hidden in the stall forever since other people would inevitably need to use the facility sooner or later. He admitted that he had also been caught up in the moment and made a serious cardio mistake, but he expressed a sincere hope that they could eventually put this whole ordeal behind them. Ju-eun softly agreed with him while continuing to prepare in the cramped space. Dojun finally stepped out of the stall and closed the door while promising to wait for her just outside. Once he was alone in the main part of the restroom, Dojun felt like his brain had officially short-circuited. He leaned against the wall in a state of total bewilderment and wondered how he was ever supposed to look his former tutor in the eye again. His heart was still drumming a frantic rhythm in his chest, and he felt completely unable to control his nerves after such an sus encounter. Inside the stall, Ju-eun let out a long and heavy sigh while she sat for a moment and finished preparing. She looked drained and uncertain while reflecting on the unexpected turn the night had taken. A short time later, the two were walking down the quiet night street under the glow of the city lights. The silence between them was so thick it felt like it could be cut with a knife, and Dojun concluded that the situation had reached a record-breaking level of awkwardness. He was inwardly cursing his own lack of social skills and wondered why he could not have said something more charming or smooth when they were back in the restroom. He felt like a total weirdo for his clumsy behavior and decided that the best way to ease his mind was to distract himself by scrolling through his phone. As he fumbled with his pockets, his eyes went wide with a new kind of panic when he realized his device was nowhere to be found. He came to the terrifying conclusion that he must have left his phone back in the bar's restroom, and he frantically told Ju-eun that she should just head home without him while he went back to search for it. He was ready to bolt back toward the bar when Ju-eun quietly stopped him and held out the very phone he was looking for. She had managed to grab it for him before they left, but she did not seem ready to hand it over just yet. Dojun reached out to take his phone, but Jo-eun held onto it with a firm and trembling grip. The atmosphere shifted instantly as she looked down at the ground with a pained expression and wondered if he were truly going to leave her like this. Ju-eun was still gripping the phone tightly while standing right under the glowing neon sign of the Sunshine Cardio place. She looked at Dojun with eyes full of desperate emotion and wondered if he was really going to leave her all alone after everything that had happened. Just as the tension reached a peak, the phone in her hand began to vibrate with a persistent call from Ra-on. Dojun tried to offer a nervous laugh and reached for his device, but Ju-eun was not interested in letting him escape so easily. She lowered her head and pleaded with him to stay with her for the rest of the night teaching cardio, which left Dojun in a state of total shock. Despite his mounting confusion, he eventually found himself agreeing to her request. The scene shifted to the quiet interior of room 203, where Dojun was currently sitting on the edge of the bed while trying to process the absolute chaos of his evening. He reflected on the fact that he was only 20 years old and had somehow ended up in a cardio place after a series of increasingly bizarre and heart-pounding events. He was currently wearing a tan bathrobe and nursing a massive sense of internal conflict. He admitted to himself that he definitely liked his former tutor, but he was completely baffled by her sudden change in story. He remembered how she had previously claimed to have a partner only to now insist that she had always been single and unattached. He covered his face in his hands and wondered what on earth they were doing there and how his life had managed to spiral so far out of control. He looked back at his simpler days and realized that he really just wanted to be at home peacefully playing video games. He felt that everyone around him was becoming incredibly taxing, and he missed having a single moment to himself without some kind of drama. The bathroom door eventually creaked open and Ju-eun stepped out from the shower. Dojun tried to hide his blushing face behind his hands, but he could not help sneaking a peek through his fingers as she approached. The air in the room became thick with an awkward, nervous energy as she sat down right next to him on the bed. They both sat there in a heavy silence while their hearts hammered against their ribs like frantic drums. Ju-eun looked at him with a trembling expression and softly asked him to teach her cardio for the rest of the night. This was the final limit for Dojun, who realized that, since she had already given her clear consent, there was no longer any reason to hold back his feelings. He took a deep breath to steady his nerves and decided to finally take charge of the situation. Then they started an intense practice cardio session. Later, Dojun sat there in a total daze while the toll of the evening finally caught up with him and left him wondering if he had perhaps let his cardio excitement get the better of him. He looked down at the girl beside him and felt his heart drop into his stomach, because he was certain he had pushed her past her limits. Ju-eun was currently buried in the pillow and let out a soft sound that sounded suspiciously like a sob, which caused Dojun to spiral into a state of sheer panic. He frantically waved his hands and began to apologize for overdoing cardio exercise while asking himself if he was officially the worst person on the planet for making his former tutor cry. He was convinced that he had ruined everything with his lack of restraint and sat there waiting for the inevitable lecture. Ju-eun eventually turned her head and revealed a face that was flushed and tear-streaked, but her expression was far from angry. She glanced at him with a look that suggested her tears were simply a result of the overwhelming intensity rather than any real sadness. Dojun felt like a criminal standing before a judge and offered a very formal and shaky apology while bowing his head in shame. Ju-eun eventually managed to find her voice and told him that she just needed a few minutes to wash up and regain her composure before they left. The night air felt cool against their faces as they eventually stepped out of the place and began walking down the quiet sidewalk together. The atmosphere between them was thick with a new kind of awkwardness that made every step feel like a chore. Dojun was still nursing a heavy sense of guilt and eventually stopped in his tracks to deliver a deep and dramatic bow right there on the street. He shouted his apologies while admitting that he must have been harboring sussy feelings for her for a long time without even realizing it. He explained that those hidden emotions were the reason he had acted with such sudden and unexpected intensity during their session. Ju-en was completely taken aback by his loud confession and frantically tried to get him to stand up before they attracted a crowd. She gave him a soft, reassuring look and insisted that he shouldn't be so hard on himself because she had actually enjoyed their time together quite a lot. She reached out and gently patted his head while offering a warm smile that melted away his remaining anxiety. She concluded that since they had both made a cardio mistake with each other, they could simply consider the matter settled and call it even. They shared a final nervous exchange about seeing each other next time before Ju-eun waved a graceful goodbye and disappeared into the night. As Do-jun walked the rest of the way home, his mind was a whirlwind of internal conflict, and he felt like an absolute disaster for how he had treated her. He let out a long sigh while clutching his head and wondered how on earth he was ever supposed to look her in the eye again after everything they had shared. He felt a deep sense of pity for the girl who was always so kind to him, and concluded that he was officially a total dumbass for his behavior. He finally reached the apartment building and tried to slip inside as quietly as possible, but the universe was not finished with him yet. The moment he stepped through the door, he realized that the lights were still on, and he was met with a sight that made his blood run cold. Ra-on was sitting at the table in the middle of the dark living room and looked like a vengeful spirit waiting for its next victim. She stood up with a look of pure fury and demanded to know why he was crawling back home at such an hour. Before he could even form a single sentence of defense, she lunged forward and grabbed his shirt with a grip that likely left permanent marks. She was absolutely livid that he had the audacity to hang up on her earlier and demanded a full report on what he was doing with Ju-eun while threatening to end his life if he lied. Do-jun tried to shield his face while asking why she even cared about his business, but his protest only added fuel to her emotional fire. Ra-on claimed that the only reason she was even awake was because the sound of him sneaking in had disturbed her peaceful sleep. She gripped his collar even tighter while demanding to know the truth behind his late-night activities and his sudden disappearance. Do-jun was trapped between her terrifying energy and his own exhaustion, and he realized that the time for hiding had officially come to an end. He let out a frustrated sound while trying to pry her hands off his clothes, and finally decided that he was going to tell her exactly what happened. The clock on the wall continued its rhythmic ticking as the midnight showdown in the living room reached a boiling point. Do-jun felt his patience wearing thin while he processed the fact that his roommate was currently treating him like a prime suspect in a high-stakes investigation. He reflected on his already terrible mood and the sheer audacity of being grabbed by the collar the moment he stepped through the door. It occurred to him that a normal conversation was officially off the table when one person was being so incredibly confrontational and aggressive. He tried to brush her off and head for the safety of his room while wishing she would just leave him alone to process his grim situation in peace. He felt that the entire ordeal was being blamed on him, as if he were the sole architect of the evening's chaos. His attempt at a graceful exit was cut short by a sudden interruption as Ra-on decided that words were no longer sufficient. A powerful strike sent him reeling across the hardwood floor with a pained sound that likely echoed through the entire apartment building. Do-jun lay there in a state of total bewilderment, while wondering what he could have possibly done to deserve such a violent reception from his childhood friend. Before he could even gather his thoughts or get back on his feet, Ra-on was looming over him like a vengeful shadow. She began a relentless assault while Do-jun frantically tried to shield himself and begged her to just go back to bed and leave him be. He realized he was trapped in a whirlwind of chaotic energy and began to fire back with his own verbal frustrations about why she even cared so much about his personal life. The atmosphere shifted instantly when he noticed that Ra-on was actually trembling with a mix of rage and genuine sadness. He watched in silence as her eyes filled with tears just before she abruptly stopped her attack and fled toward her own room with a final slam of the door that rattled the walls. Do-jun was left alone on the floor to contemplate his life choices while nursing his new bruises and wondering why his roommate had become so unpredictable and emotional. The scene shifted to the bright morning sun streaming through the windows of the apartment as a new day began. Do-jun emerged from his room looking like a total zombie and clutching his head as he dealt with a body that felt completely sore from the previous night's physical gauntlet. He stumbled toward the kitchen for a glass of water while acknowledging to himself that he hadn't managed to get a single wink of sleep. He found himself face to face with Ra-on, who was just coming out of the bathroom with a towel draped over her head. They stood in the middle of the hallway and shared a long and heavy silence while carefully avoiding eye contact at all costs. Both of them looked completely drained, and they eventually parted ways without a single word, as if they were both too exhausted to even acknowledge that the other person existed. Later, the sizzle of breakfast meat in the pan provides a small distraction from the mounting tension in the apartment. Do-jun stands over the stove with medical patches on his face as a painful reminder of the previous night's disagreement. He lets out a heavy sigh while reflecting on how his attempt at a peaceful life has turned into a constant struggle for survival. He finds himself staring into the kitchen sink and wondering why everything has to be so difficult when all he wanted was to be a normal college student. He eventually retreats to his bed and tries to find some solace in his mobile games while lying flat on his back. Even though the screen flashes with a victory message, he feels no real sense of triumph as he stares at the glowing display. He lets out another long sigh and realizes he has no idea what he is even supposed to say to fix the mess he has created. He knows he tried his best to handle things his own way, but the situation seems to be spiraling further out of his control with each passing hour. Meanwhile, out on the city streets, Ra-on is walking with a look of pure irritation as her phone rings with a call from her mother. Her mother is currently enjoying a day out with Do-jun's mother, and she is eager to know if the two roommates are having a wonderful time together. Ra-on clenches her fist in a state of silent fury and tells her mother to stop bringing up Do-jun's name altogether. Her mother remains completely oblivious and comments on her daughter's obvious temper while wondering if the two have had another fight. Ra-on is hit with a wave of intense annoyance and struggles to keep her composure as she listens to her mother's cheerful meddling. Back in the apartment, Do-jun's phone begins to vibrate with a series of frantic notifications that make his heart sink. He looks at the messages from his mother and realizes with a jolt of terror that Ra-on has officially snitched on him regarding their recent conflict. His mother is absolutely livid and declares that he is basically a dead man if he does not fix the situation immediately. She demands that he apologize and beg for forgiveness while making it very clear that his financial support is on the line. The threat of not receiving a single penny is the final blow to his pride, and he realizes that he has been backed into a corner. Do-jun falls back onto his bed in a heap of pure frustration and curses his luck for living with such a calculated snitch. Do-jun lay on his bed in a state of total mental anguish while realizing that he really did not want to go through with his mother's demands. He trembled at the thought of having to apologize and wondered how he was ever supposed to match the intense energy Ra-on had shown during their previous encounter. He couldn't help but remember the sight of her in that elaborate anime costume and felt his face heat up as he recalled his own bold declaration of liking her. He tried to convince himself that he was only doing this for the sake of his bank account and not because he actually cared about fixing their relationship. He told himself that his motivation was purely financial and that he would simply wait until she returned home that evening to get the ordeal over with. The hours ticked by slowly as Do-jun sat at the dining table with his head resting on the hard wood. He watched the clock move past midnight and began to spiral into a new kind of worry while wondering if she had perhaps gotten into an accident or decided to run away for good. He felt that it was incredibly weird for him to be the one considering reaching out first, but the silence of the apartment was starting to weigh heavily on his nerves. He sat there in the dark and reflected on how Ra-on must have felt the previous night when she was the one left waiting alone in the living room. He admitted that it was worth staying up for her even if her temper was currently set to an explosive level. The front door finally creaked open and Do-jun jumped in his seat as he saw Ra-on stepping into the apartment. He was startled by her sudden appearance and immediately shouted out to ask why she was returning home so late in the evening. Ra-on looked completely exhausted and tried to walk past him without saying a single word, which caused Do-jun to panic even further. He wondered if she was planning to ignore him forever and quickly lunged forward to grab her before she could disappear into her room. He began to stammer through a very awkward and frantic apology while trying to gauge her reaction in the dim light. He realized that she was still incredibly mad at him and decided that the only way forward was to finally come clean about his whereabouts. He told her that she was right about him being with Ju-eun and begged her to just listen to his explanation for once. In a desperate move to keep her from leaving, he slammed his hand against the wall and trapped her in place while pleading for her to hear him out. Do-jun has Ra-on pinned against the wall while pleading with her to just listen to him for a single moment. Ra-on is visibly flustered and her face is a deep shade of red, but her eyes are still filled with a defiant fire as she wonders why she should ever bother listening to him after the way he ignored her earlier. The tension in the hallway is so thick that it feels like it might snap, yet Ra-on is not the type to stay trapped for long. Before Do-jun can explain himself, she launches a sudden punch that he actually manages to block with a surprising amount of speed. He even lets out a small laugh while feeling quite proud of himself for finally stopping one of her attacks. But his sense of triumph is instantly shattered when Ra-on follows up with a much more effective kick to his cardio gear. The impact is so severe that Do-jun is sent reeling with a pained shout while he feels as though his entire world is spinning. He collapses onto the floor in a heap of pure agony while Ra-on stands over him with a cold and unimpressed huff. He tries to muster enough strength to ask if she is finally satisfied now that he has confessed his feelings, but his words only seem to make her even angrier. She shouts into the quiet apartment and tells him that she has absolutely no desire to hear what he has to say, especially after he spent the whole evening refusing to answer his phone. She demands that he stay away from her room and makes it very clear that their conversation is officially over. Dojun is still trembling in pain, but he refuses to give up and reaches out to grab her arm as she turns to leave. He begs her to just wait for a minute so they can settle things, but Ra-on responds with a sharp glare that could likely freeze water. Without another word, she brings her heel down onto his foot with enough force to make him scream in a new kind of misery. The sound of her bedroom door slamming shut echoes through the room, while Dojun is left alone on the floor to nurse his growing list of injuries. He shouts at the closed door about how he admits he made a mistake and was only trying to find a way for them to get along like normal human beings. Feeling like a total failure, he decides that staying in the apartment is only going to make his headache worse. He scrambles to his feet and doesn't even bother putting his shoes on properly as he stomps out the front door into the hallway. The scene transitions to the city streets, where a torrential downpour has turned the night into a watery mess. Dojun stands under the bright lights of a convenience store and looks out at the rain with a face that perfectly captures his internal defeat. He reaches into his pockets and realizes with a jolt of terror that he ran out of the house without his wallet, which means he doesn't have a single cent to buy an umbrella. He stands there in the middle of the storm and has a deep internal debate about whether he should drop his pride and ask Ra-on for help. He initially tells himself that he would rather face a cold and watery end than admit he needs her, but a sudden and terrifying bolt of lightning makes him realize that living is a much more attractive choice than his pride. He pulls out his phone and carefully types a message asking if she could please bring an umbrella to the convenience store near their house. He hits the send button and watches the screen with a mix of hope and dread while the rain continues to pour down around him. The minutes tick by slowly, and Dojun grows increasingly frantic as he realizes that she is not reading his message at all. He stands there hunched over his glowing screen and wonders if she is ever going to come or if she is simply enjoying his suffering from the comfort of her dry room. He eventually remembers how much she screamed at him for not answering his own phone earlier, and the realization hits him like a ton of bricks. He concludes that his roommate is definitely not coming to his rescue, and that he is officially stuck in a very wet and very lonely situation. Dojun watches the relentless rain through the store window and lets out a heavy sigh while realizing that he is well and truly stuck for the night. He concludes that there is absolutely no use in hoping for a miracle and accepts that he must wait out the storm in the company of the snack aisles. As he leans his head against the cold counter, his frustration begins to boil over while he reflects on how his roommate completely ignored his heartfelt apology before slamming her door. He feels a deep sense of misery at the thought of having no peaceful place to stay, and wonders if he is doomed to spend the rest of his life constantly making amends for things that go wrong. In another part of the city, a phone begins to vibrate loudly on a nightstand and pulls Juan out of a peaceful sleep at the break of dawn. She groggily reaches for the device and wonders which brave soul would dare to call her at such an hour, only to sit bolt upright when she sees Dojun's name on the screen. Dojun immediately offers a shaky apology for waking her up, but confesses that he has absolutely no one else to turn to for advice. Ju-eun settles into her blankets and tells him to just let it all out, while she secretly scolds herself for being so eager to hear about his latest drama. Dojun launches into a detailed explanation of his disastrous night and describes how he fought with Ra-on after accidentally hanging up on her during a critical moment. He recounts the physical gauntlet he endured and complains that while he was definitely in the wrong, she has taken her revenge to a level that seems more than a bit excessive. Ju-eun listens to his frantic rant with a patient smile and realizes that she has once again become his unofficial counselor for all things related to his roommate. She takes a moment to process the chaos and tells him that reconciliation is a difficult path that requires a lot of patience. She explains that the only real solution is for them to eventually sit down together and talk things through, even if the silence between them feels heavy and uncomfortable. She warns him that even after an apology, things will likely remain awkward for a while because that is simply the nature of fixing a broken connection. Ju-eun concludes the early morning counseling session by suggesting that a change of scenery might be exactly what the two roommates need to finally fix the mood. She truly believes that things will go well if they just try, and eventually tells him to get some sleep before sinking back into her pillows with a tired groan. She stares at her phone in the quiet of her room and feels like a bit of a fool for being so incredibly invested in his complicated life. Outside, the heavy clouds finally decide to give Dojun a break, as the downpour slows to a complete stop. He lets out a massive yawn and feels a wave of relief that he no longer has to play the part of a convenience store resident for the rest of the night. He starts making his way back home through the quiet streets while thinking to himself that he definitely needs to deliver another apology tomorrow to really seal the deal. His internal planning is suddenly interrupted when a closed umbrella is shoved into his personal space with a sharp and sudden motion. He looks up in total shock and finds himself staring at a very exhausted and very red-faced Ra-on. She is panting heavily as if she just ran a marathon, and her oversized shirt and cap are slightly damp from her frantic journey to find him. They stand there in a heavy silence amidst the puddles as the realization sets in that she actually came out to rescue him after all. Ra-on immediately turns to walk away without saying a single word, but Do-jun manages to call out a sincere apology that stops her in her tracks. He looks at her retreating back and remembers the advice about changing the mood to bridge the gap between them. With a sudden burst of courage, he reaches out to stop her and struggles to find the right words before bluntly asking if she wants to go on an outing the following day. Ra-on freezes as if her brain has just encountered a critical error, and she stares at him with wide and watery eyes. She looks absolutely overwhelmed by his sudden assertiveness, and eventually tells him to stop being such a cheeky bastard as tears begin to well up in her eyes. Then she reacted with her typical intensity by swinging the umbrella at him and making a scene in the middle of the wet sidewalk. She eventually snapped the umbrella shut and walked away while muttering about how annoying he was, but Do-jun couldn't help but notice the deep blush creeping up her neck. He stood there in a state of total bewilderment, wondering if her arrival meant she had finally forgiven him or if he was just signing himself up for more physical punishment. The following afternoon found the two of them at the local cinema tower, standing at the concession stand in a state of mutual awkwardness. Do-jun was currently doing his absolute best to act like a normal person, but he was a blushing wreck as they ordered a popcorn set for two. He stole a glance at his roommate and realized that she looked completely different than usual. Ra-on had traded her oversized hoodies and caps for a black turtleneck and jeans that perfectly highlighted her athletic figure. It was clear she had made a massive effort to dress up for the occasion, and the realization left Do-jun feeling completely flustered and uncertain of where to look. He found himself caught in a loop of staring at her and then quickly turning away whenever she looked back. Ra-on eventually reached her limit and turned to him with a flushed face, demanding to know why he was being so weird and what exactly he was staring at. Do-jun scrambled to play it cool by claiming it was nothing, while inwardly realizing that her new look was making it nearly impossible for him to focus on the movie. He wondered how he was supposed to survive a 2-hour film sitting right next to her when even standing in line was proving to be a challenge for his heart rate. Once they were settled into the dark theater, the atmosphere grew even heavier as the sounds of the film filled the room. Ra-on sat with the large bucket of popcorn clutched firmly in her lap, looking as though she were ready to defend it from a rival army. Do-jun watched her out of the corner of his eye and eventually leaned in to whisper that she shouldn't be such a pig and hog all the snacks for herself. He suggested that since he was the one who paid, he deserved at least a few kernels. His attempt at playful banter earned him a swift and painful retaliation, as Ra-on reached out and gripped his ear with a level of strength that made him gasp in shock. She whispered back with a menacing glint in her eyes that if he wanted to call her a pig, then he could just sit there and enjoy the movie on an empty stomach. Do-jun retreated into his seat to nurse his stinging ear and rub his head, wondering why he always felt the need to provoke the only person who could consistently ruin his day. They spent the rest of the screening sitting in a cloud of tense, blushing silence while their hearts hammered against their ribs in a steady, rhythmic beat. Do-jun eventually decided to give in and shove the bucket back toward her as a sign of defeat, concluding that his survival was more important than his pride. The sudden tension in the theater left Ra-on in a state of absolute shock as her brain struggled to process what Do-jun had just whispered something sussy in her ear. In her confusion, she accidentally loosened her grip on the large bucket and watched in slow motion as their salty snacks tumbled to the floor and scattered across the dark carpet. Do-jun was equally mortified by the clumsy disaster and tried to deflect his embarrassment by pointing out that she really should have been more careful with the expensive popcorn. Ra-on responded with a glare so intense it could have scorched the back of his head, and Do-jun immediately backtracked while raising his hands in a gesture of total surrender. He concluded that it was definitely his fault for provoking her in the first place, and realized that his best chance at survival was to stay as quiet as possible until the credits rolled. After the film, they eventually made their way to a brightly lit PC cafe, where Do-jun felt the need to apologize for the theater incident one more time. Ra-on looked like a haunting ghost of her former self, while she stared blankly at her monitor and mourned the loss of the snacks and the ruined mood. To make amends, Dojun pulled out a credit card and made a grand gesture by telling her she could order anything she wanted, including extra computer time and as much food as her heart desired. He felt a sharp pang of guilt as he remembered his mother's stern warning about only using the card for absolute emergencies. But he decided that preventing another physical attack from Ra-on definitely qualified as a life or death situation. Ra-on's mood shifted instantly from gloomy sadness to pure sparkling excitement as she realized that her usually stingy roommate was actually treating her for once. She clutched the card with a look of total joy and thanked him with a bright smile that made her face start to steam from the sudden surge of positive emotions. Dojun watched her with a small and slightly proud expression before realizing he had a major technical problem of his own to handle. He stood up from his seat and explained that his computer was currently useless because he couldn't hear a single thing through his headphones. Ra-on suggested that he should just stay seated and relax next to her instead of making a scene, but Dojun was determined to head to the counter and get the situation fixed before he lost another second of his gaming time. Dojun sat at the computer terminal and stared at the inquiry screen in a state of mounting frustration while he tried to get someone to listen to his technical problems. The audio on his machine was completely non-existent, but the person on the other end of the chat was being incredibly dismissive and insisted that everything was functioning perfectly. After being told that the staff was far too busy to deal with his complaints, Dojun felt his patience finally snapping and decided that a face-to-face confrontation was the only way to get results. He told Ra-on that he was heading to the counter to see what they were actually up to and marched away with a determined look on his face. As he reached the kitchen area, he found an employee in a state of total system failure while she battled against a mountain of food orders. The woman was hunched over a stove and muttered a flurry of curses about the lunch hour being over and the greedy customers who had decided to order every single item on the menu. Dojun's eyes widened in pure horror as he watched the stressed-out cook add a very secret and unhygienic ingredient to the frying pan out of pure frustration. He stood there, paralyzed by the realization that he was about to pay for a meal that had been seasoned with pure spite, and began to tremble at the thought of Ra-on actually eating it. He scrambled back to the terminal and frantically suggested to Ra-on that they should probably find another cafe or maybe even a different hobby entirely. Ra-on was completely confused by his sudden change of heart, especially since she was still looking forward to the feast he had promised her just minutes ago. Before they could make a clean getaway, the exhausted employee arrived at their table with a tray of steaming kimchi fried rice. She leaned over Dojun and began listing off the rest of their order, including the dumplings and noodles that were still in progress. She even offered to fix the sound problem on his computer while her close proximity left Dojun in a state of total nervous panic. The atmosphere shifted instantly when the employee paused and looked closer at the two people sitting in the booth. She realized that the customers she had been grumbling about were actually her old friends, and she pulled down her mask to reveal a very familiar face. It was their chic and usually composed friend Da-Rei, who looked completely different in her casual work clothes and messy bun. Ra-on and Dojun could only stare in total shock while they tried to process the fact that their sophisticated gaming buddy was the same chaotic chef who had just declared war on the lunch rush. Da-Rei offered a casual greeting as if nothing were out of the ordinary. Da-Rei was thoroughly amused by the coincidence of her friends showing up at her workplace, and she did not hesitate to point out that they were giving off heavy sussy vibes despite their constant claims of not being close. This observation caused Ra-on to experience a total internal short circuit, and she immediately reverted to her usual defensive state by grabbing Dojun by the back of his shirt in a frantic attempt to maintain her composure. She began to lecture him about being a nuisance while shaking him back and forth, which only served to confirm Da-Rei's suspicions that their dynamic was far more complicated than they let on. Seeing that she had successfully rattled them, Da-Rei decided that her shift was officially over and she was ready to get out of the stuffy cafe for a proper meal. She casually took back the tray of fried rice and announced that she would be refunding the rest of their order so they could all head out together. Dojun was left in a state of total bewilderment as he was hauled away from his gaming station and led toward a dimly lit bar where the atmosphere was much different than he had anticipated. He sat at the table and watched as Da-Rei began to pour drinks with a level of intensity that made him wonder if he had ever truly known the real her. The chic and composed version of the older sister figure he had in his mind was rapidly being replaced by a version that was much more chaotic and unpredictable. He leaned over to whisper to Ra-on and wondered if they were actually in the right place or if they should be worried about the expensive plate of rose pasta that had just been dropped in front of them. Ra-on, however, was currently lost in a vivid and slightly terrifying memory of a past trip to the PC cafe where things had taken a very dark turn.